Hello, and welcome to the IFORS Global Webinar Series. This webinar is hosted by our Euro regional grouping. I'd like to just go over a few housekeeping notes, please. All questions will be answered after all three speakers have completed their presentations. Please use the Q&A box to direct questions to the speakers. For most of you, the Q&A box will be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Your name will show automatically. In the box, please indicate where you are from and who your question is directed to, followed by your question. You may use the chat feature to communicate with other attendees. Now I'd like to introduce the IFORS President, Grazia Speranza.
Thank you very much, Mary, for the introduction, and welcome to everyone. I'm very pleased to introduce this webinar, and I would like to create sort of the atmosphere for the webinar we are having today. And first of all, I would like to remind all of you, those of you who have not attended the previous webinars, that these webinars are organized by IFORS. And IFORS is the federation of all the member societies of IFORS 54. So the societies of operations research around the world are members of the International Federation of the Operational Research Societies. And all these societies are organized in 4 regional groupings. NORAM, as you can see on the map, ALIO, South America, NORAM, North America, IFORS, Asia Pacific area, and Europe and Africa. And yeah, you can go on with the slide, please. And IFORS has a committee, as you can see from this slide. And this committee, besides the past president, the vice president, the secretary, the treasurer, includes 4 vice presidents who represent the 4 regional groupings. As you can see, Rosiane from Brazil, representing ALIO, the South America region, Suniti, representing IFORS, the Asia Pacific, Euro, represented by Stefan Nico, and Carla represents the North America region. So given that, unfortunately, this year, we could not have our triennial conference, we decided to create new opportunities for us to get together and to get to know each other, and especially to create knowledge across different regions. That's why we have organized these global webinars, and each webinar is organized by one of the vice presidents representing the different regions. So we started in July. We started in July with the first global webinar, and that global webinar was organized by the VP representing South America, Rosiane. And in September, we had the second global webinar organized by Suniti and with speakers from IFORS, from the Asia Pacific area. And you can find on the website of IFORS the registrations, the recordings of the previous webinars. Today, we are having the 3rd global webinar, and this is organized by Euro, by the Euro region. And next to me, there will be the introduction of Professor Bonze, the Euro president, and then the talks that will be given today will be chaired by the VP representing Euro, Professor Stefan Nico. Manuel, I'm very pleased to give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Grazia. Welcome also from my side, from Servus, from currently sunny Vienna to the world. It's great to have you all here. I want to thank IFORS, in particular, President and all the team around Grazia Speranza for organizing this great series, this great opportunity to interact, if electronically, but still interact and exchange ideas on occasion of this webinar series. So I am currently the president of the oldest regional grouping of IFORS. You can see a short timeline here. The first international conference was also hosted in Europe, in the UK, 2 years before. And after that, 1959, IFOS was founded. And after a process of preparing a European association, 1975, Euro was founded. Next slide, please. Euro is an association of national learned societies, so it does not comprise individual members, but societies. And in total, Euro would represent some 10,000 individual members organized in their national societies. You can have here a list of countries throughout Europe, and also some countries traditionally linked very strongly to the European OR community, as South Africa or Tunisia or Israel. So we have quite a variation, as kindly pointed out by President Speranza, that we extended somehow the regional network, if you wish. Next slide, please. And as with all the other regional groupings, I suppose Euro is a non-profit organization, a charity, if you wish, with the aim to promote of our field, operational research, domiciled in Switzerland. We have a body of a council who regulates the affairs. This council contains representatives of the national member societies, and the day-to-day operations are governed and managed by the executive committees. So the executive committees is a smaller group of people who organize, among many other things, also the council meetings, which will be held annually. And for that purpose, the EC, the executive committee, must of course meet a bit more often. So twice a year would be the regular meeting. This year, this particular year, we had more meetings, but it's a different story. Next, please. So there are some people, of course, behind this governance. Apart from myself, there's the upcoming president, Max Evo from France. The executive committee is consisting also of vice presidents, 3 currently. So Vice President 1, Joanna Józefowska from Poland, Julia Benel from the United Kingdom, England, and Claudia Archetti from Italy, currently affiliated to a French university, to Paris, along with the treasurer, Marino Widmer from Switzerland, and the secretary, Jesper Larsen from Denmark. So these people work hard, but they are, without the support of the additional Euro officers, it would even harder. So Stefan Nickel was already introduced. Of course, we have the heart and soul of the association, Sarah Force, the manager of Euro. We have Bernard Forts from Belgium as the information technology manager. We have very important position also is the one of the conference advisor in international relations, Gerhard Wilhelm Weber, and the website editor, executive assistant, Diane Wilson. So I already took a lot of your time. So very quickly, browse through the Euro instruments. So our goal is, as I said, to promote operational research. So with this, we try to achieve it by several different instruments. Of course, organizing conferences and meetings, also at all levels of the scientific career, also student-focused activities like PhD schools and summer winter institutes. We also foster a series of publications ranging from a book series on the advanced tutorial to 4 journals, large and smaller journals. But this is also complemented by a high activity level work by our fellow operational researchers organized in working groups focused on particular topics, and also forums with particular issues, aspects of operational research. We also have a series of prizes and awards, typically announced or awarded at the Euro conferences or IFORS conferences if Euro conference does not take place. There is a support fund, and of course we try to keep up with the modern communication means by social media and the internet, using the website and also of course the newsletter, which is regularly sent out to members. And with this, last slide please, I would like to remind you in particular on one very important instrument, which will be the upcoming Euro conference, hopefully taking place in Athens mid-July. We are very optimistic now that this will take place in a traditional way to foster personal interaction between them within our scientific community. And with this, I would ask Stefan to take over, and thank you once again for being here, for organizing and listening and taking part into these great networking activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. Okay, so I'm taking over. I'm speaking here directly from the Christmas market in Karlsruhe. So to give you some impression, of course, there is no Christmas market in Karlsruhe, but you can imagine one, and this is the one from last year. I'm proud and happy to be the chair now of the content part of this webinar. And Manuel already talked about that we have some instruments in Euro, and one is the Euro working groups. And indeed, if after the talks you think, how could you get such good speakers? It's just what the working groups proposed, and we selected from more than, I think, 10 very good proposals. We selected the 3 which we thought in the Euro Executive Committee which fit most to these times and for this event. So we focused on, I would say, 2 main topics, so mobility of tomorrow, say, and health. And so the 3 talks are mainly about that topic. And so that we don't start with health directly, we will first have another topic which will also have us occupied for the next maybe 10, 20 years, how to get some climate change done. And one of the instruments is, of course, to have increased electric vehicle adoption. And the first speaker I would like to present to you is Miguel Anjos. I will also present the other 2 speakers, but probably I don't do it now. But maybe before I give you some information about Miguel, let me tell you that you can write your questions in the chat, and we will have a question and answer session after all 3 talks are over. Each talk will be approximately 20 minutes, but we will be relaxed. I will give them 10 seconds extra if they need. And then, of course, we can just shut the microphone off. No, so we will approximately have 20 minutes each talk, so that we have between 10 and 15 minutes for questions. Maybe there's not enough time for all questions, but we will be happy to provide you with contact information to the speakers so that you can ask them maybe more intense questions later. Okay, so our first speaker, Miguel Anjos from Edinburgh at the moment, worked a lot with people in Montreal. So also we have some NORAM link. And as I said, he will talk about the increasing electric vehicle adoption and how to place charging stations there. Maybe you could see, I don't know, the slides are gone now. He could see all his merits. I can read them for you if you want. So he has a bachelor from McGill, a master from Stanford, a PhD, University of Waterloo, which I just visited last November when it was still possible. Very nice university. And also a nice place, Waterloo, because there's nothing else to do than be at the university, probably. This helps research. Sometimes this is really good not to have the most attractive cities. I mean, also nice and calm and concentrating ones. He works a lot on applications of mathematical optimization, and yeah, you can read here all the things. Maybe I shouldn't take the time away from Miguel. You can see he's the right person to talk about that topic. And I would like to hand over to Miguel, and please give us the news on how to locate and place charging stations to increase electric vehicle usage. Please, Miguel.
Thank you very much, Stefan. I just want to confirm that you can hear me.
Yes, I hear you.
Yes. And I'm now sharing the screen, so that should be working as well. Okay, is that all right for the screen, Stefan? You can hear me and see the slides?
Perfect. Now full screen, perfect.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be presenting here today. As Stefan mentioned, I'm going to be talking about how to increase electric vehicle adoption, specifically by looking at optimal deployment of charging stations for electric vehicles. And I want to mention that this is joint work with Martin Joyce Muniz, who was at Polytechnique, formerly working with me and is now at FICO, and Bernard Gendron, my colleague at the University of Montreal. I also want to acknowledge that this work was supported by Hydro-Quebec, by IVADO, and by Canada's NSERC through its energy storage technology network. And Hydro-Quebec in particular has been very proactive in supporting this work, which is greatly appreciated. Now, first, I want to start by giving you a little bit of motivation about the work, and then briefly mention the state of the art and where our contributions come in terms of what had not been done before, the mixed integer linear optimization model that we proposed, and a very brief overview of computational results before concluding. Now, in terms of motivation, well, Stefan already mentioned that we want to decarbonize transportation. And the perspective of this work is very much from the policymaking point of view. So we have already around the world various countries that are setting targets for future EV adoption. And in fact, some countries are even putting on plans for banning sales of non-electric vehicle transportation from years as varied as 2025 in Norway. The UK just recently announced 2030. Quebec and California are aiming for 2035. And Norway is really a leader in this respect. Currently, if you look at new car sales, they represent about 60% of them in Norway. The focus for this work, working with Hydro-Quebec, was on the province of Quebec, Canada. And it originated from an ambitious set of targets set by the government of Quebec in 2016, which was to have 100,000 EVs on the road by 2020, 300,000 by 2026, and 1 million by 2030, which would represent, based on the number of vehicles in 2016, 20% of all light vehicles. Now, where are things actually? In 2018, there were about 30,000 EVs on the road. And as of August this year, there's already just about 82,000. So it's not too far off the target. It's not quite there, but it's not bad at all. And the government in Quebec has now doubled down on this and said, right, we're going to aim for 1.5 million by 2030. So this is not letting go the effort to increase electric transportation. Of course, the question is, how do we reach such targets? There's really a recognition that there are two main deterrents to EV adoption. The first one is the cost, and that's typically been addressed by a range of purchase incentives, which can be in direct cash or in terms of benefits that one has if one is driving an electric vehicle. And the second main deterrent is something called range anxiety, which basically means what it says. People are concerned that the car may not go far enough and that one may run out of electricity on the way to where you're going. And there's a comment just in the chat earlier that I saw about someone who's saying, let's see how far I can go with my new electric vehicle. Question then from the policy perspective is, how can we overcome this range anxiety? And we can talk about increasing the EV autonomy, which is really technological improvements, mostly on the battery capacity. And then one can also talk about, can we make available public charging so that if people feel that even if the battery is not quite sufficient, it is going to be possible to recharge along the way. And Quebec is heavily investing in this strategy of providing public charging infrastructure. And going a bit further into the thinking process, this leads us to an optimization problem. We have an objective to install charging stations using a certain budget. And then the question is, how and where and how many charging stations do we install each year until 2030? So we're looking at a multi-year deployment process. We want to stay within budget, and we want to attain the targets that I mentioned earlier. So this is the setup for the work, and our objective is to provide a tool that can help in making decisions about these installation and the deployment of charging in Quebec. This is not the first work that was done in this topic. There's been quite a bit of work on two related aspects. The first one is optimizing the siting of charging infrastructure. Now, the state of the art here a few years ago when we started this work is that there were two types of location models. Something called vertex-based models, which basically means you're deploying chargers within a city, within an urban environment, and flow-based models that look at deploying chargers so that you can travel, stopping along the way from one urban area to another. The issue that we face is that we really need both at the same time. Quebec has long roads and large distances between urban environments and large urban environments as well. So the first thing that we developed in this contribution is essentially an integration of both types of location models into a single optimization model. So we optimize both within urban areas and between urban areas at the same time. One of the simplifications that we do make is that we consider only one type of chargers, but which in principle would be fast chargers, but that's, I don't think, a big concern at the moment. The second relevant work is looking at multi-period siting optimization. So this idea that we're deploying year on year. The motivation here is, of course, that this infrastructure investment is expensive and it takes time. So it will take place over time. But the future is changing. The number of people who own EVs and their geographical distribution will likely change over the coming years. So we want to also take account of that into the process. Now, the state of the art here was a string of papers that look at a multi-period optimization approach, but the limitation there is that the EV demand is given as an input. So we basically assume we know the demand in the future for every year, and now we want to have an optimal deployment, which is nice, but doesn't really correspond to our circumstances of we want to deploy so that we change this demand. Our objective is really to proactively increase this demand, get people to buy EVs. So we need to really have that dynamic demand into the model. And then the other work that's particularly relevant is the work by Zhang et al. In 2017 that was a multi-period flow-based siting problem. So it's really just looking at flow or roads in terms of the distribution. It does reflect the positive effect that charging has on the growth of EV adoption, but the way that they model the perception of how charging opportunities influence the decisions is not exactly what we were looking for. in particular in consultation with Hydro-Quebec, we had this idea that we want to have a demand dynamics that includes two particular effects, and this is where the second portion of our contribution comes in. The first one is what's called the contagion effect, which is a bit of a word these days, but in this case, it's a positive word. It means that as people see more EVs around them, they're more likely to acquire one. So there should be a positive impact from the increase in the number of EVs. And the second point is that the charging availability really should also influence this demand. So the model that we take is essentially to look at saying, well, at period T-1, let's imagine year T-1, we have a certain number of EVs. Based on that, and taking the contagion effect into account, we assume that there will be a potential number of customers to buy for the next period. And then we look at the impact of local charging and intercity connectivity charging. And putting all this together, we come up with a model that gives us how many people will have EVs the following year. And our objective is to increase this as much as possible over the whole time horizon. This is motivated also by actual data. So what I'm showing you here is up to 2017, the take-up of EVs based on, in 1 year based on the previous year. So on the x-axis, we have the percentage penetration of EVs at year T-1, and then on the y-axis, the penetration at year T. So this shows that this is a line that shows that there is an increase. It's a line above y equals x. So it shows that there is an increase, and roughly it looks piecewise linear. Although, of course, these are very preliminary numbers because the numbers are actually rather small, except for Norway, where the penetration is already getting non-negligible at that point. So we really took this as influence for our modeling and integrated this kind of idea into the optimization. And this now leads me to telling you about how we put it all into a mixed integer linear optimization model. So we have to make siting decisions. This is the key point. We're going to have a set of candidate locations, which is my set N. And then I have T, which is a set of investment periods. So think about 10 years, 15 years, and think about any place where you would like to have a charging station. So we're talking a fairly significant number in the thousands of locations. And now we have binary variables, Y, that indicate which locations we choose to put charging points. So Y tells me if I place a station there or not, if I open a station there or not. And then X is an integer variable, not binary, but an integer variable telling me how many charging points I put there. Because I open a charging station, but I can have multiple charging points. And those are two different decisions because there's a cost associated with each of these two aspects. So these are the fundamental decisions that I want to take. And then I have some constraints on them. First, I have to stay within budget. So the total cost of making these decisions has to be within budget overall and for every time period. I have to respect the fact that each location has a maximum number of chargers that I can put. So there are capacity constraints on each of these locations that very much depends on the way they are in terms of how much space is available for chargers. There's a constraint that once I open a station, it should stay open. So each station is open at most once. And then the fact that if I have an open station, then I have to have at least one charger installed. Okay, so this is the core of the optimization model. These are really the key decisions that we want to make. But now around this, there are other aspects that come along. First is I have the objective function. And so the objective function is to maximize the total sum of these H variables. And these H variables are the number of EVs in a population center who charge at a certain location within that population center. So I'm basically saying that by the time I get to the end of my planning period T, my last planning period, which is the cardinality of capital T, if I sum up all of these numbers, I want it to be as large as possible. Our target is really to maximize EV penetration. And we do this using these H variables. So now I have to understand how can I make these H variables progress. So these are essentially the number of people using EVs and charging in our network. And that's what I want to maximize. This is the idea of the piecewise linear function that I mentioned before. So we're going to have on the x-axis, the activity at t-1, and on the y-axis, my g of t-1, so my potential customers for the next time period. And I'm going to use, and these are data, these are input to the model. I have an intercept O, a slope M, and some breakpoints Q that are given data. And this tells me how people will react given a certain amount of charging capability and a certain amount of adoption into the system. So taking that, I now start looking at how people are going to behave. If I look at potential customers, now what I do is I want to know two things. I want to use W as a 0-1 variable that's going to tell me the penetration level in a specific urban zone. Okay, so I'm now measuring how many people in a given urban zone at period time t have EVs. And W tells me how this level goes. And basically W maps, if I come back just once, tells me which segment of this curve to look at, right? Because this is piecewise linear. It's not just a straight line going off up all the time. And so W is going to tell me where to look on this line. And Z is going to be the actual number of EVs based in a given urban zone at a given penetration level at a certain point in time. And if you're starting to get a sense that there's a lot of things to take track of, you're right. This gets quite detailed, but it is the level of detail needed to be able to get the information that we want. And these now, well, we have constraints that say that we have to calculate the EVs in each urban zone and assign the Z variable to the right level of the piecewise curve, as I mentioned. We also have that each urban zone has to be at most at a single penetration level at each period. And then we have these other constraints that bring in the piecewise linear function explicitly and determine the number of potential new EVs in each urban zone. Okay. So we start with a certain number of EVs. As we install chargers, this number of potential EVs increases, and then we have more take up, and then it keeps going up over time. But the driver are our decisions of making charging capacity available and increasing increasing the penetration level. Now, this is looking mostly in terms of urban zones. And I said, well, we also need to look at what happens in terms of between urban zones. So this leads to the whole question of charging. And now I'm not going to get into the details by any means, but the basic idea is now we're looking at traveling between urban zones. And I have some parameters here, D, omega, and gamma, that basically tell me the frequency of charging in the urban zone or at home versus on the road. Okay, so I need some information of the behavior of drivers amongst the population. And then I need information about, okay, which paths can they take to go from one urban zone U to another urban zone V, and whether they can charge along the way. And whether they can charge along the way depends on whether I've decided to put chargers along the way. Okay, so these, some of it in data, some of them are variables linked to the other variables. And the bottom line is that I can use all of this to put together the right constraints. The first set of constraints wants to determine the number of EVs that can travel between each pair of urban zones. So this is saying full capacity of transportation, given that I've installed the chargers. The second set of constraints tells me that I have installed the chargers as necessary for given paths. And then the third constraint says, okay, even if I've installed the chargers, there's a maximum number of EVs that can charge at that location. Okay, so we keep pushing the number of EVs, these variables H, as high as we can, but of course they're bounded by the decisions that I've made in terms of location and also by whether they charge on the road or not, and where I am over time. So I can put all this together and I get a very large mixed integer linear problem. Some of the variables are binary, some of them are continuous, some of them are pure integer, not 0, 1. And that then brings the question of, can I solve this model? Well, let's first look at the kind of problem we're looking at. If I look at Quebec, this is a model that we created, a data set that we created, and we see that we have about 2,300 locations, several hundred population centers, and 40 urban zones. If we want to go beyond Quebec, we'd want to look at something like California, where we have 4,600 locations, 1,800 population centers, and 75 urban zones. So you can really see these mixed integer problems become quite large quite quickly, especially looking at realistic cases. And indeed, that's the case. So one of the things we looked at is using a primal heuristic to generate solutions. So we're not worried first about optimality per se, but just about finding a good solution using a heuristic. We simplified by looking at one period at a time. We simplified the sub-problems by fixing the penetration level rather than having it as a variable, as well as the number of potential customers, and then having some flexibility on the budget. So by doing this, we were able to get reasonably good solutions, and then using those, we can warm start CPLEX. If you just run CPLEX on the problem, you basically get nowhere. This is just too large with a timeout of 14,400 seconds. If we use first the heuristic to generate an initial point and warm start, then with the same runtime, you see that the heuristic takes much less time, and we can get a pretty good proof of optimality gap with respect to the solution that we found, best solution that we found, and some measure of how the adoption is progressing. So you see that we're getting pretty good evolution on the adoption. So this gives us the progression of the adoption that we want and a plan for how we should deploy our budget to get there. And this is being used to inform decision-making at Hydro-Quebec for the past couple of years. So it's really having an impact in that sense. It's also a new optimization framework in terms of a scientific contribution, and we were able to get some very nice results. I will skip just to the last slide and indicating that, of course, there are many open questions still, and there's further work being carried out in collaboration with a nice group at the University of Montreal and another very nice group in Irinox INRIA with the colleagues that I indicate there. And these are some of the questions that we're looking at. In particular, we haven't integrated real demand information yet, so this is something that's ongoing. There's the whole question of customer preferences. Will people actually choose the station that we think they will choose? There's questions about pricing, questions about congestion. But if you want to know more, I'll be very happy to discuss it more, or we have a first paper that's out with the more details of these results that I presented today. And we also have the data set. These instances that we created are now publicly available, and I will be very happy if other people can use them to further research in this area as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. So, I'm trying to make a 200 clap voice. I don't know, maybe we should have
Thank you.
some pre-recorded applause. We are working on it. Maybe on the fourth webinar, we get some pre-recorded applause. Thank you very much. I must say I'm working on similar topics, and I would have alone questions for 10 minutes, but of course, there's no question and answer, but I will write you an email at some point, I guess.
Thanks.
Just to keep the time schedule, thanks very much. We will move on now to the healthcare part. And first we have Nico Vandaele. You can also see that he comes from Applied Economics OR from the Catholic University in Leuven. And he's now a full professor there. And he's the director of this Access to Medicines Research Center. So who, if not Nico, can tell us about what are good approaches in the OR to cope with the COVID-19 challenges. So after his talk, maybe Richard has to add some things, but 90% of the problems will be solved after Nico's talk, hopefully. No. Sorry, don't put the expectations too high. But what you will see, what is interesting, I don't want to read all the merits of Nico, but you can see that he's one of the coordinators of the Euro Working Group on Humanitarian Operations. And then you will see also that Richard, the last speaker, is closer maybe to the working group on healthcare. And you can see also what is nice with working groups to have two different angles to approach probably the same topic. So I think I shouldn't steal you much time. So Nico, if you are ready.
I'm ready.
So I hand over to you and I look forward to your talk. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I hope everything turns out right in sharing the screen. Can you just say that you see my starting slide?
Perfect. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, lovely. So yes, thank you, Stefan, for this nice introduction and indeed putting expectation extremely high. And there's one thing I can already say with certainty. There's a lot of uncertainty these days, but the certainty is we will not solve COVID-19 stuff, everything today. But anyway, I think our community can definitely put some nice light on all these issues. And also, I think the human operations or humanitarian operations working group has a special light to shed on that. And I hope I can share that with you. And indeed, the title we have chosen with my colleagues from the working group is a transdisciplinary system-based OR approach. So we will try to combine, okay, how can OR serve, in fact, from a humanitarian point of view, the COVID-19 challenges we face. And I hope, okay, so this is indeed our working group. I will not go into these writing details, but the two keywords for today I want to, let's say, highlight are decision making, of course, right? But also methods, techniques, and tools in a plurality. So let's say we have a toolbox and the problem is there, and how can we combine, let's say, a lot of these tools to get the things as best as we can today. So this is my group. I will not tell you too much about it, but what I want to say is that through the years working on this type of problems, and I'll give you a very short history in a minute, is that we end up today with a transdisciplinary team. So facing these OR problems, we, of course, the people speak from themselves here on our group, but they come from pharmacy, they come from IT, they come from the medical field, they come from sociology. And in fact, together, the first biggest step is to understand the problem we're facing. And then, of course, methodologically, we try to get around that. And of course, I will deal a little bit more specifically with modeling today, but you see, it's a whole type of combination of things we want to deploy. And these are in fact the three pillars. If you ask me what are the three pillars in all the projects you do from a humanitarian point of view is, and I would love to start with the lower left one, is the human-centeredness. So at the end of the day, a human being will be, let's say, getting the outcome of our modeling and decisions, and they will also make, let's say, the things work. If they are not, let's say, trusting our solutions, or they think it's too much black box, we will have a position to solve the problems, right? Or the decision making taken care. So the humans here, and you see in vaccination, which is a very important element also for COVID-19, you see already therefore a very important human beings. You have the people, the person who needs to be vaccinated, you have the caregiver, you can the mother, you have the nurse, or I mean the healthcare worker, and you also have some other, let's say, community-based people who really have to engage to get these things done. And we will all face in all countries of the world these things as from New Year on, I think, if we come to the vaccination programs. The other one is the system thinking. So we learned sometimes by the hard way that these things are all interconnected. And you already saw here, to talk about sustainability, you also have to talk about budgets, right, Miguel? So there's a whole kind of interconnectedness in the problems we try to solve, and we have to realize that and take that into account. And sometimes learn things we have never thought before that they would, let's say, be part of our problem setting. And then the third pillar, I will not go into that today, but that's in fact a design thinking approach, right? And that could be read by interested people at the reference you can see here at the bottom. But it in fact means that at first, before we even start modeling, and modeling is the third step out of the 5, we have to figure out what's the goal of our problem, who are the stakeholders, what are they measured on, and then from that data collection point of view, we can start modeling. And then hopefully it's not finished, right? It should not end up in our cupboard or in our, let's say, a drawer. It should be implemented. It should support decision making with all the good and the bad things which may happen there. But I think that's our duty as a community. So you see that a picture on the right. I love that picture. It was on the back of a nurse in Kenya, Nairobi, where she said, okay, do you want to protect your kids from HIV? Let me explain you how. And that's in fact what we have to start. Okay, what's the goal of our efforts? These are the projects my team is currently working on. You see there's a kind of quite some connection between them. I go from left to right very quickly. So there's a childhood immunization, let's say measles, polio, these type of things. Then you have the multi-protection things that more and more, and before COVID-19, traveling indeed confronted us with yellow fever, with other types of diseases. HIV is another one where indeed there's it's also an infection, right, which is not cured today. Well, not cured. You can suppress it and take a moderate life with it, right? But it's not, let's say, curable. And probably in the future we also have a vaccine, and that's why we're also interested in that point of the HIV problem. Pathogen X, which is in fact everything before COVID-19, we were really struck in March by having already projects on these diseases you see there. Now it's COVID-19, but it could be equally one of these 5. Okay, we were building models. Is the world prepared for these diseases? The answer is very clear. No, the world was not prepared, and not even for these diseases. The world is not prepared today. And for COVID, of course, we suffer now all together, and we try to get around the problem as quickly as we can. And of course, while we were dealing with these 5, let's say, prioritized pathogens, it comes from a WHO list and a CEPI list. We of course we've tumbled into COVID-19 for sure, like many other researchers all around the world. So I want to add here now 3 things, and now you see immediately these pillars. So we always see prevention versus outbreak response, and that's what we face today. So today we have an outbreak response. That's the only thing we can do now. So we respond to the outbreak, but hopefully we can also prevent the outbreak by indeed all the measures all countries are taking now. And that it means in fact that, okay, if we don't have social contacts or a particular contacts, we can more or less calm down the outbreak. That's in fact what we do currently. And that's in all of these projects, in fact, let's say implicitly in there. Then we have the bottom one, it's the prevention versus the treatment. So as soon as the COVID-19 vaccine is there, we can work preventively. So to avoid even the outbreak instead of outbreak response, right? So that's then the second thing, which always coming back. And the third one is human behavior. And all of these things, human behavior is so crucial. And that's why I started 2 slides ago with this, let's say, human-centered approach that whatever we do, whatever we calculate, the nicest models, if the human beings are not convinced of what we're trying to do, I think a lot of, let's say, the efforts go away, but also it's also learning us a lot. And that's also something hopefully I can convince you today. Okay, coming to COVID-19 and using these 3, let's say, pillars, human-centeredness, right? The right-hand picture is somebody who is infected by COVID-19. So there you can only cure. And there's indeed a huge bunch of research now currently going on the antivirals. And we also engage in those projects. So the question is, can we cure the people who are sick? That's not the scope of the talk today. But of course, we want to avoid that. And then immunization comes in. And that's, in fact, where we try to model this thing. So a human being kind of, let's say, reflection is, and you see there are only 4 of them, right? So, and that's what we have to turn into, let's say, constraints and objectives and so on, is indeed, so the vaccinee, the person who needs to be vaccinated, does that person has access? Is it affordable? Is it reachable? Is he hesitant, that person, right? And there's a lot of things to do these days with a lot of anti-vaxxer type of, let's say, atmospheres and rumors. We have to cope with that. Also, from our OR and behavior OR type of, let's say, modeling. Then the vaccinator, okay, we can assume that every doctor and every nurse is very convinced about the vaccinations and about the positive outcomes. That's not sure, definitely not taken for granted. So there are a lot of issues there also, so that our models can say, okay, we have a transportation model which makes sure that the vaccine is good condition at the final point of administration. But okay, what will we go on? Do we really need the health outcome given the fact that our supply is perfectly organized? And then, of course, for who? And there's a big discussion now, and this will come to my objective function, of course. What is fair and equitable? How can you distribute vaccines fairly and equitable, or other protective equipment, whatever? I mean, if there's a shortage, of course, from mathematical formulations, we know that there's some dual prices and things like that, but it's about the objective function. How do we model this? That's not clear even to us. We have been dealing with philosophers and with people who try to understand how a human is, let's say, touched and let's say thinking about these fairness and equitability, and that's definitely not an easy thing. We are more and more deeper into the discussions about, because we need to collect data to formulate our objective, but where do they come from? How do we get these data, and how do we support the decision making on that, especially if it comes to target and vulnerable populations under circumstances of shortages. And then, of course, everything which has to do with regulatory, expert opinions, and technical details, which are not that easy to get these days. Why? Because there's not everything there yet, and they're still developing, they're still, let's say, working on all these elements. This is then the second pillar, which is the systems approach. Okay, I will not go into all of these steps. I think everybody can read for him or herself, but you see that everything we try to model in these subsystems, it's not an independent island. It all connects to all the other subsystems, and we have to, let's say, take that, well, not for granted. The major part is, of course, the lower part. So we are currently working with everybody in the globe there. So how can we get down on the outbreak, and how can we be sure that this, as quickly as possible, is countered? But of course, we hope that we can come into the planned immunization loop, but it's not yet sure. But there's a big chance we will run into kind of flu type of vaccination policy in the future, with a yearly repetition and with some small migration of let's say, the vaccine and so on. So that's already something we have to be prepared for, that it will not be done if everybody got his COVID-19 first shot. There will be, of course, for the newborns and the people come in, but also for the ones who already have a vaccination. Not all vaccines will have, I think, a long-lasting effect. There are some which probably have a longer lasting effect than others. And then the third one, as I said, I will not go into details because this would take us too far, but you see at the end, we have to rely on many different methodological, let's say, techniques, and everything can come into the picture, both from the qualitative side, the quantitative side, the mixture of it, deterministic, stochastic, whatever. So these are the techniques we already let's say, incorporated in our projects so I cannot discuss all of them, of course, today. But what is important, maybe one thing, is here at the bottom, these apples, right? So these are the 5, let's say, nice scenarios or nice decisions we can offer the decision makers as scientists, as experts. And then the decision maker has to take the favorite apple in that case. But we're sure that all these apples are fine and good for different reasons, and the one is red and the other ones are green. Okay, that's fine, and we can have opinions on that, but at least that the decision maker is offered good options, and that the minor or inferior or dominated options are not presented for decision making. Okay, and then I go a little bit deeper, not in the formulations, because that will bring us too far, but a little bit in how they are connected. So how are all these formulations connected? And if we assume that the COVID-19 is more or less, can be considered as a system, I will touch 3 supply models. One, and a couple of the epidemiological models. I will not touch the demand models because they are a bit specific, but they also definitely needed, especially the hesitancy modeling on human behavior is quite important these days. Okay, so this is then the first model. That's a supply network. I think we recognize all of that. And that's a typical COVID and non-COVID, let's say, situation where you have on the left-hand side the bulk production. In the middle, you have the formulation, filling, and packaging, which is typical for a vaccine. And then you have what we call the big regional stores. You could say European Union has one big regional store. It could be 2 or 3. That's not the point. But at least this is a classical network, let's say, formulation of what is, of course, now very difficult is that most of these elements here are not known yet today. There's still a lot of negotiations going on, political decision making. So our model will change not only in, let's say, in and out of a particular element or variable, it will even change the relationship within the model. We have to be prepared for that. And that's quite challenging that let's say, as soon new decisions or new developments, let's say, in medical science come in, that our model needs to change. And for those who make decisions, that's of course very uncomfortable because you present the model and the model changes the next day because of new insights. And that's something we have to agree and learn to live with because we do not know everything today. And this is then what is the outcome? What can such a model give? If we have modeled this whole network, this is the outcome. And this is typical for, let's say, a outbreak response type of model when the outbreaks are localized. So not global, not a pandemic. You see, you build up a stockpile, and then the stockpile is consumed if small outbreaks occur in the world. So that's in fact a better situation than we have today. Okay, and of course, given of the, let's say, characteristics, because this network I just showed, that's of course shared resources for all types of vaccines. There's a rush now for manufacturers of vaccine, for glass manufacturers, for adjuvants, for transportation, for, let's say, -80 CO2 ice, and so on and so on. So all of that is a very, let's say, restricted these days, and that is the result. You see, the buildup of the stockpile will not go for each vaccine as it would love to. Of course, if you go to COVID-19, it's more like this. You see on the top figure, then of course, everything which will be produced on COVID-19 will as quickly as possibly be distributed and go to the vaccination points, because we are fighting the pandemic and everybody is waiting to have, let's say, a release of the restrictions. So it will go through as much. So that's a different story compared to this one. But in the end of the day, it's the same network, right? So we have to already prepare for the next step while still fighting, let's say, the fire. That's a bit the idea, okay? Then, so if the network can be modeled and give these numbers to us in terms of volumes and timing so that the countries and everything can be prepared, then these are, let's say, a list of elements which are in the model. I will not review all of them. I promise not to put that into mathematical formulas or relationships, but you see a bit that the major characteristic is we have to start mainly from scratch in the COVID-19 situation, and many things are not yet known and will change. I already explained that a bit. It's a living model, we call it that way. So even some of the, I heard this morning in the news that Moderna has published a very good remark on their vaccine. But next week there could be another type of measures here or there, and we have to adopt again. So that's very important. And also the broader ecosystem already discussed is very important to know. Who will pay for the whole world, all of this stuff? Then the second one is the typical allocation, you could say. From a war, we know that you have a sink and you have a source, and then, okay, we try to allocate the material which is available from time to time in the whole, let's say, vaccine supply to the countries needing it. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, because what we have available is not, let's say, acceptable to all countries and vice versa. So there's a lot of, let's say, discussion going on where a vaccine is made, where it can be used, and so on. And the price is, of course, also an element. So we can maximize the health outcomes subject to the diversity of the constraints. That's very nice said, and it has to be the model, but it's not easy to put that into numbers and equations. And we're really struggling with that. I'm very honest and open on that. So this is, for instance, what we have as a guideline. This is what the WHO has published. Okay, the objective function of our model should contain this. I think hopefully nobody disagrees with this, because that's all quite fair and nice to understand. But how can we put this into numbers to do calculations with? That's a very big challenge, in my opinion. Oh, sorry, my cursor was running away a bit. Okay, and this is how the WHO, you see WHO is also trying to get a common denominator for everybody in the world, and then of course sub-regions and countries or the European Union to give one will of course further detail these type of guidelines. And this is the one taken from the COVAX facility based on the WHO guidelines, and you see here clearly the goal: protect public health and minimize societal and economic impact. That's easy to understand, I think, but difficult again to put into numbers. And what numbers are you using? Are the numbers up to date? Are countries reporting all these numbers the same way? And so on and so on. So we are, for instance, now trying to figure out what are the countries ready to, let's say, accept all these vaccine volumes if they come in. And that's also already that. The point is a very important element, because that will influence, of course, your distribution along the world. Okay, then you see here that it will be, of course, time dependent. We currently build it on monthly time buckets, but that, of course, could be refined or could be aggregated. We also see the proportionality and the ratios coming in. And that's, of course, if you say we will, for instance, the European Union, we will divide the vaccine according to the population, more or less we can agree on how many people live in every country in the European Union. But of course, that will not be enough, because some countries suffer more from particular, let's say, comorbidities, or have more elderly population than others, and things like that. So how do we incorporate that into the fair allocation? Again, given the shortage at every month from the vaccines which will come in, because everything that will be produced will be immediately put into the vaccination stage. Okay. Then a buffer. And that's very, for me, nice to see that also already here, the WHO is preparing for the next stage. So instead of only doing something for the outbreak response, we already think about stockpiling for, let's say, a more, let's say, steady state type of so how do you decide what do you will put in the buffer and what do you immediately ship to people who need it probably the most? That's a very even ethical type of thing to put in the constraints. And then, of course, already some hard numbers here and there, 3% for healthcare workers, and then 20% for, let's say, people who have a very, let's say, a medical risk. And then on top of that, you come to policemen, fire brigade, civil workers, and so on and so on. That's of course, the guideline, and that has to be refined in our models. So here you see a bit a summary of all this, what we currently put in our model. So there's some physical constraints, of course, regulatory issues, because a vaccine made in country X will not be accepted by country Y for this and this reason, right? Financial, some countries, as you know, have already commitments to buy, others have options to buy. And that's also complicating matters a bit, because they will be much more ordered than you really need, and so on and so on. So how do you do that if this materializes in terms of these contracts? And these contracts are, of course, organized per vaccine. And okay, that will also that's also a very complicating factor. And again, as already suggested, the time dependency of both supply and demand is very key. This is how it works currently. How do these two models interact? So we have a network which generates a throughput. So what can the network produce? Because everything that will be produced is needed. So that's the nice thing of the story. Everything you can put out of the network will have a good destination. But then, of course, that destination has to allocate that. Given all the constraints we just talked about, there will be countries who will not get what they need. And then others will have more than they need, but it cannot be shipped to that country because regulatory or other things are not okay. So that's really tough. So what do you have? You will have a feedback loop back to the network. Then you will say, oh, we need more production of this. That production should be switched to that, and so on and so on. So there's indeed what you could say, what's there first, right? So it's a kind of a feedback loop you have already between the two models. And this makes it even very complicated, because as you can imagine, that the production decision and the allocation decision is, of course, let's say, located with different decision makers, and that makes also the thing quite complicated. Okay. Then, if we come to the third model, then assume now we have the production, we have the allocation, and then a country, like every country where we live in, has that national stock on the left, let's say, coming in, for instance, month to month. Then you have indeed in the country the distribution system, and then at the last mile, you see it here. I don't know whether you you see here my my cursor. You have schools, you have workplaces, you have pharmacies, you have outreach, you have at your home, you have at your physician, and then here the are the fact that the demand populations you want to vaccinate. And you see it's a bit, it's not completely right, but it's a bit the downsized of the global problem. So within a country, you also have to decide on regions, on vulnerable populations, and the objective and the constraints will also be similar. They're not exactly the same, but they're similar, okay? And then the system approach, as I already said, we have to recombine all these things to see how the disease, of course, will react. And we will see that the disease in certain places will go down, in other places it will not go down. And how do we react to that with our decision making from the network, the allocation, and the in-country distribution? Okay, so going further a bit on that system approach, and so we already want to work on a planned immunization, but currently we are in an emergency immunization, and these worlds have to live together. And that's also something we hopefully, if we do investments in the emergency immunization, can we recover these resources in the planned immunization? Just give me, allow me to give you an example. If we now invest in production plans and that there's not only the production plant, but it's also the people, the skilled people. They are now working 24 hours, 7 days a week to get these vaccines produced as quickly as possible. But suppose now that the vaccine is very successful, after 3 years, what will we do with these plants? What will we do with these people? I think it's very important already from a sustainability aspect that you already think about the plant immunization, and maybe also for other diseases and other types of, let's say, uses. Okay. And then this is my concluding point on also a very nice award type of thing. It comes from my queuing, let's say, history. That's when you combine flows, of course. The end state is, of course, a combination of the flows. And suppose now we have 3 independent flows. You need the person, you need the healthcare worker, and you need the vaccine. And the vaccine, let's say the supply chain is behind that. Then we have this kind of system. Right? Suppose the vaccine is there in availability 95%, workforce 95%, and population 95%, then the immunization success of these 3 flows independently assumed, so of course an example, is 86%. That could be okay from, let's say, an immunization point of view. But of course, suppose now there's delivery failure, whatever reason, that's not important now, and you have there 80% instead of 95%, you already, that it goes down, sorry here for my cursor, to 72, right? And then, for instance, the workforce, if the workforce gets sick and they are not able to do the vaccinations, or they are scared, or whatever the reason may be, they're not paid. In many countries, there's an issue of payment of these things, okay? Then, of course, you also run into problems. Yeah? And the population is hesitant, which is a big problem these days. Then, for instance, 70% of hesitancy, you have 63%. And I will not, of course, if you have all things at the same time, then we definitely don't want to see the number. Right. So the immunization is definitely at stake here. Okay. So what I try to say as a conclusion here is that indeed that although there's a technical or war type of reality behind all these decision problems, it has a lot of flavor of human behavior and let's say impact, which we cannot deny in our modeling and implementation. Here you see that also the COVAX facility is already taking.
We are running relatively late, so
okay, I will speed up.
5 minutes over time, so sorry to interrupt you. But
no problem.
Richard will get angry with me. So
okay, I will close down here. So this is another project from our humanitarian operations group. It's called HEROES, where also the system aspects and some, let's say, human behavioral things show that you have to take all that into account. Otherwise, the very nicely calculated things will not work out as they should. These are my colleagues, Tina Gomez and Youngi Kovacs from Hangen and Delft, respectively, in the other rivers. So as a final slide, and then I will stop. So on the left, you see the typical characteristics of the models we have discussed. So they're indeed very uncertain, dynamic, and so on and so on. I will not repeat that, right? But from an OR community point of view, I definitely, if you allow me to add some things, is that our merit is definitely there, but there's quite some delay in expressing and writing papers and things like that, because it's an emergency. And I feel that with a lot of researchers, this is playing a big, yeah, it's also a choice fund. Shall I help the emergency, or shall I write it down in a paper? Because it takes your time away from modeling and decision-making support, right? So also there, I think and that also accounts for many humanitarian operations problems. I think societal impact should also a little bit be more, let's say, rewarded or taken into account as far as we can go, of course. So this is then indeed my final conclusion. Yeah. So if we can start from the problem, we definitely have to put a lot of investment in learning new methodologies and combining new methodologies or existing methodologies. Okay, I'm done. So I give back.
Okay, thank you, Nico. Again, it's the 200-person claps here I'm doing, and again I would find already 20 questions I would like to discuss with you about this very interesting system perspective on healthcare problems, which is really nice. But I'm afraid we have to move on to keep a little bit the time schedule. I mean, it's nice that we have all these interesting talks and time flies. I would just like to tell all people who had questions, please don't write them only in the chat, but also in the question and answer section. And maybe if you want, please add your email address. So in case we have too less time to answer, if you want, leave the email address, and maybe the speakers would be happy to write you just a short comment on your question, just that nothing gets lost, okay? And I directly move on to Richard, who looks now more in the micro perspective, so more on the operations perspective of the pandemic situation. Richard, again, here are the facts. You can see he's very qualified. And we talked a lot about stochastics and queuing, and this is exactly his field of expertise. He's a real well-known expert in queuing systems and bringing into stochastics into the system. And he will tell us something about the COVID-19 challenges, about forecasting bed occupancy and intensive care units. So instead of looking at the system as a whole, look into the hospitals and look how they operate well. So Richard, are you ready to take over?
Yes, thank you for the introduction, Stefan.
Okay, please, it's all yours.
Okay. Is this okay?
Perfect.
Good. Then we can start. So thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of the work we are doing in our group related to helping healthcare to prevent the pressure on healthcare due to COVID. So I selected one of our projects. This is the one on where we forecast the occupancy of wards and intensive care units, which basically has to do with how we can so if we can forecast ahead of time, then of course we also know where to send new patients and things like that. So we did this jointly with part of our choir team, Steph, Sander and Aleida, and with various hospitals. So ETZ, which is the hospital which had the largest share of COVID patients in the Netherlands, also the first patients. Leiden University Medical Center, which is now still in that area, still very, very busy with COVID patients. Rijnstaat is also in the same area as this Elisabeth II Steden Hospital. Also many patients hospitalized there. So what we are aiming for is to come up with a real-time forecast of the bed occupancy in hospitals, and we want to make it such that our forecasting modules run inside the hospital to help them make decisions on whether or not to accept new patients, whether or not to transfer patients to other hospitals, issues like that. And so what you see here is the result, or a result. This is a screenshot from the Leiden University Medical Center. Within their business information system, they have implemented our results to actually predict the number of new patients, but all COVID patients, but also the occupancy in their wards and in their intensive care. So, and then next to that, so the prediction is here in the top left-hand corner of the number of patients. The prediction of the number of people infected in the region is here in the lower left corner. Well, this is Leiden, so that's a map of the country, or at least part of the country. And this is their recording of the length of stay of patients, which they are actually recording on a day-to-day basis in their hospital information system. So how did we get to this prediction, and what type of modeling did we use for that? So the challenge is to come up with a forecast of COVID-19 bed occupancy in hospitals, but also within the region and in the end within the country. What we're in particular interested in is what's the maximum number of beds occupied in the next couple of days. Because if you know that, then you also know whether or not you run into capacity problems. So in the Netherlands, we had in the first wave, we had serious problems with ICUs being completely filled, and we also saw that, of course, in many other countries. And if you can predict that ahead of time, then you can already also take measures to alleviate the pressure. So our ultimate aim is reallocation of COVID patients among hospitals, but I will not discuss that today. That's current work. So today I will present you our model for a single hospital and the results from our analysis. So for a single hospital, that typically consists of a COVID ward and a COVID ICU. So they're isolated wards and isolated ICUs that are fully devoted to treating COVID patients. So each of these, So this hospital faces an arrival of patients, say, with a time-dependent arrival rate, and it is time-dependent because, of course, the number of people infected in a region changes over time. So this is a time-dependent arrival rate, which I'll call lambda, and then a fraction of those patients is directly admitted to the ward, and the other part of that patients is directly admitted to the intensive care unit. Then patients may stay in the ward for some time, and then they may be discharged, so they will leave the hospital, or they may be transferred to the intensive care unit when their condition degrades. When they arrive in the intensive care unit, they may spend some time there, and then they may leave. And unfortunately, if they directly leave from the intensive care units, very often they die. But it need not be. But they may also return to the ward to continue their recovery. And so this is the model, and of course within this model there is a flow of patients, and all these rates, parameters, and distributions are needed to come up with a good forecast of the number of patients in these different parts of the hospital. Now, it's important, of course, to realize where will the information come from. So what we do is we use the information directly from the hospital information system. So all information on patients is recorded in this hospital information system, such as, for example, the number of patients admitted at the ward per day, per hour. We have the timestamps of that. The characteristics of the patient, so BMI, age, gender, are very often recorded. And from that, we obtain the length of stay at the ward and at the ICU, as I will explain you later how we will do that. And also from that we obtain the fraction of patients transferred, discharged, or also the fraction of patients that dies. And all of that we do on a time-dependent basis, because with COVID, the treatment protocols change, the number of infected change. So all of these parameters in our systems change over time. So we have to follow the system over time and obtain the parameters in a time-dependent fashion. Now, this is the type of information then that we have. So of course, this is highly anonymized, but for every patient that's admitted to the hospital, we have the timestamp for the moment that it arrived from home, say to the intensive care unit. That's patient 4 in this case, and then also the timestamp, say, which is transferred to another department, or when it leaves the hospital. And in this case, for patient 4, unfortunately, this patient died. So so we have the timestamps for every activity of the patient within the hospital. Very well documented. Of course, it takes quite some time for us to get the exact numbers without mistakes. That's what you often see in data analysis. But in any case, several hospitals, there are 5 listed here, have provided us with these data, and there are more to come. So this is the input. And then the next question, the next step is, how do we then, so what we get from that? So what we get from that is forecast of the bed occupancy. And in this case, I've shown you the Leiden University Medical Center. And I show you this one because it's the poorest performance results that we have. So I thought I may just as well start with that. So don't make anything more beautiful than it is. So what you see in the left top hand graph is the occupancy at the ward. As realized, and that's predicted by our model. It's not very easy to see, but there's a red graph, and the red graph is the actual realization. And then there is a orange graph, a light blue graph, a dark blue graph, and a purple graph. And those are the 1 day ahead, 2 day ahead, 3 day ahead, and 5 day ahead predictions, forecasts of the number of patients in the ICU on the top left-hand corner on that day. And in the top right-hand graph, it's the prediction for the wards. And you see, especially, say, the second part of May, our predictions are less good, and that's because there was a dramatic change in the number of people admitted to the hospital. So there was a sudden surge in infections, which caused our prediction, that's especially the ones 3 and 5 days ahead of time, to just be 3 days late, of course, in predicting that, because that's what you do when you predict 3 days ahead of time. The prediction for tomorrow and the day after tomorrow is already there. So the first day that you can, of course, update your prediction is day 3. So that's what you see in those graphs. On the lower graphs, on the left, you see also a prediction for the intensive care unit, and on the right for the ward. But what we see there is only the 3-day ahead of time prediction. And then not of the number at 1 day, but the maximum number of the next 3 days. So that number is used for steering, because if this maximum is high in the next 3 days, then you want to stop admitting patients to your hospital and send them somewhere else. So that's what we're actually focusing on this maximum. And there you see, so as I said, the red one is the realization again, and the blue one is the 3-day ahead prediction, and then the shaded area is the confidence interval for the prediction. So there you see that this maximum is predicted actually very well. So how did we get to these predictions? And in the end, how did we get to the implementation? So I want to show you how that works. And so what we see in a model, as I just described, of course, is patients arrive to the hospital. They're either admitted to the ward or to the intensive care. And when they're transferred from the ward to the intensive care, when their condition degrades. So then, and when they're in the intensive care, they're transferred to the ward when they recover. So upon admittance to the hospital, actually each patient follows its own trajectory, with its own length of stay in the ward, its own transfer probabilities from ward to ICU, its own length of stay at the ICU, and its own transfer probabilities again to the ward. So the most suited model to analyze this, at least from a network of queues perspective, is a network of 2 infinite server queues. Because as soon as the patients are admitted, there is no capacity restriction on the total number of patients. They're just, the only thing that matters is where will they be and how long will they stay. Now, and within this, the very general setting of networks of infinite server queues, what we have used is what we call, that's not we, what Messi and Witt have called the person arrival location model. So that actually follows trajectories for each patient individually, patches all those trajectories together to come up with a distribution of the number of patients in the ward at each point in time in the future. Now, the model then is as follows. So let NCW and NCI record the number of patients with characteristics such as body mass index, age, gender, at time t in the ward and the ICU. Then, from theory, we know that these random variables have a time-dependent Poisson distribution for the number of patients at time t in the ward. And these Poisson distributions have means rho CW for the ward and rho CI for the intensive care units, and they are available in closed form, and it can be directly determined by the arrivals, the lambdas and the p. So this is the total arrival rate of patients, and this is the fraction of patients that goes to the ward. The length of stay distribution, LCWT and LCIT, and the discharge and death probabilities. And that's, those means are determined by those parameters via the Poisson arrival location model. So that's we know from theory. Oops, and oops, that's fast. And then, so in some special cases, those rows are known explicitly. For example, if the length of stays would be exponentially distributed, but they are not, yes, then these rows can be obtained from a set of linear differential equations. So the rate of change of rho is determined by the inflow of patients to the wards, the inflow of patients from the ICU, and the outflow of patients from the ward. And the rate of change of the mean number of patients at the ICU is determined by the inflow of patients to the ICU, the inflow from the ward, and the outflow, with some initial conditions that reflect the current number of hospitalized patients. Now, this is if these length of stays would be exponentially distributed. I just included this to give you a flavor of the type of equations we are dealing with. If the length of stay has a general distribution, independent of the arrival time of patients and transfer probabilities, then these rows are actually obtained via the expectation of this integral expression here, where this is just the integral over the length of stay of a patient at the ward of the arrival rate of patients to the wards, where the arrival rates again are a solution of a set of equations. This is the direct arrival rate of patients to the ward, and this is the arrival rate of patients from the ICU. So it is similar but slightly more complicated, but unfortunately in our network of ward and ICU, we have time varying length of stay, time varying transfer probabilities. So the expressions for rho and CW and rho CI are more involved. I did not include those expressions. They're cumbersome and they're not useful for this presentation. So from this, we can actually obtain the performance measures we're interested in. So for that, I need some more notation. I have introduced bold L, W, bold Li as at time S, as the realized length of stays of patients in the ward and the ICU. So these are the length of stays of the patients that are currently residing in the ward and the ICU. And we know that this number of patients have a time-dependent Poisson distribution, and that means that we can compute the mean number of patients at time S plus T, so T time units later, both for the ward and for the ICU. That's direct evaluation from the results that we have from queuing theory. And we can also do that for the maximum occupancy at the ward and ICU in the interval between S and S plus T. So that's the maximum of this N over this interval S plus T, given again the patients that are there at time S, both for the ward and the ICU. Well, these are the means. Next to that, we can also compute the prediction intervals in closed form. So that means that we can compute explicitly mean and the prediction intervals for all future points in time. And that is the basis of our analysis. Now, of course, this is all very nice, and from a theoretical perspective, it's all very sound, but from a practical perspective, we're only halfway there. From a practical perspective, we of course need to obtain those arrival rates, length of stay distributions, etc. And so they are not available in closed form. So what we're doing is we use statistical estimates. So for the Poisson arrival rates, lambda and p, we use what's called a Richards curve, which is a 5-parameter curve to fit the cumulative arrivals of patients to the hospital. This Richards actually has nothing to do with me. Then we estimate the length of stay and transfer probabilities from the hospital's data warehouse using the Kaplan-Meier estimator, and that's because we have right sensor data, because at time t, when we're estimating, not all patients have already left. And so we take into account all patients that have completed their length of stay at time t, and also those patients that are still there. So that's why we use the Kaplan-Meier estimator there. And then, having obtained those input parameters or distributions, empirical distributions, what we then do is we sample the patient trajectories of the Poisson arrival location model. So we sample each patient in our model. And that gives us a forecast of the rows, given that the initial distribution is Poisson, which we know from theory. Okay, now just to show you some of those curves. So these are the Richards curve for the Leiden University Medical Center on the right, and for the area in which the Leiden University Medical Center is included in for over the months August, mid-August to mid-October of the total number of infected patients, and this is then the fitted curve, and these are the number of patients admitted to the hospital and also the fitted curve. So this is type of the input that we are actually using. Now, then we sample the Poisson arrival location model. So what we do is for each patient that arrives to the hospital, we draw, say, from the empirical distribution is length of stay. Upon completion of the length of stay, we draw this transfer probability either to the ICU or to the ward, conditional on the actual characteristics of the patient. Here, when the patient arrives, we draw from the empirical distribution at time t, again, the length of stay, and either the patient leaves or the patient may transfer back to the ward, etc. So we do that for every patient at every point in time. For the patient that's already there at time t, we draw from the residual distribution of the length of stay. Of course, also in that case from the empirical distribution. So at each point in time, we draw for every patient, either when it's a new one, its length of stay, or when it's already there, its residual length of stay. And from that, we build our forecasts. So these are the forecasts for Haga Hospital, which is actually in the same region as Leiden. And now I have drawn only the realization in red and the 3-day forecast, because then the graphs are more clear. So this is the intensive care unit, this is the ward. So this is the number of patients that's there on a day. And there you see that our realization here is nicely, well, almost always nicely within our prediction interval. So which is good. And for the 3-day, for the maximum over 3 days, you see that the prediction is even better. So this is for Haga Hospital. Observe the axes, they're not the same. So they had at most, say, roughly 20 patients in their wards. The next graph is for ATZ, which is the hospital that had the most patients right from the start. So you see here, this scale goes up to 100. Yeah, so it's way more patients. Again, 1 day and 3 days. Here you see that our predictions are actually very accurate. This is for the number of patients, and this again is for the maximum number of patients in these hospitals. Now, we have used this model to show the hospitals that that predicting the number of patients in their wards based on a queuing theory model can be very accurate. And so that led them to actually implement our forecasts and our in their business information systems. So they're actually using our forecast to predict the number of patients in the next couple of days. And so I started with this slide. So this is the implementation in Leiden. We're currently working with hospitals on a more centralized implementation using a big data portal where they can upload their data, and then we run this. So this is all programmed in R. We run the R script, and then we send them their forecasts, which is of course much less time consuming than support all these hospitals in these R implementations individually. So we're trying to make this into a centralized solution, but at the moment it runs in 5 hospitals in the Netherlands and shows that it's very accurate. And then the next step is we move to a regional model, so where we are actually going to distribute patients over hospitals, follows exactly the same recipe. So the models are already there, but we still have to do the data analysis and get good forecasts. So that's why I can't show you that today, but that's, say, to be continued, work in progress. Thank you.